Suddenly, we saw someone enter the museum. But when we looked at the entrance, there were shadows walking in front of the door. The watchers in the Louvre. The fluorescent lights hummed their final song as Margaret Archambault locked the last gallery door. As a senior night guard at the Musée du Louvre, she'd performed this ritual thousands of times over the past 12 years, but tonight something felt different. The air hung heavier than usual, thick with a silence that seemed to press against her eardrums. "Bonsoir, mademoiselles et messieurs," she whispered to the paintings as she passed, a habit she'd developed in her first lonely weeks on the job. The portraits stared back with their eternal expressions, some serene, others melancholic, a few caught in permanent rictus grins that had always unsettled her. She checked her watch, 11:47 p.m. Her partner, Daniel, should have finished his rounds of the Danone wing by now, but his radio had been silent for the past 20 minutes. Margaret pressed the call button. "Daniel, to Izu," static crackled in response. The Louvre at night was a labyrinth of shadows and whispers. During the day, tourists flooded the galleries in chattering waves, their phones flashing like schools of bioluminescent fish. But after closing, the museum transformed into something else entirely, a mausoleum where history slept uneasily, where the boundaries between art and reality grew thin. Margaret's footsteps echoed against marble floors as she made her way toward the Sully wing, where Daniel had last checked in. The emergency lighting cast everything in shades of amber and shadow, and the sculptures seemed to shift in her peripheral vision, their stone limbs moving in ways that couldn't be possible. She shook her head. 12 years, and the tricks of light still got to her. The grand gallery stretched before her like a throat leading into darkness. On either side, massive paintings depicted biblical scenes, mythological battles, and royal coronations. She'd memorized every piece in this section, could recite their histories in her sleep. But tonight, they looked different somehow. Wrong. "Daniel," her voice bounced off vaulted ceilings. A sound reached her, faint, rhythmic, like fingernails tapping against wood. It came from somewhere deeper in the gallery, past Géricault's, the Raft of the Medusa, beyond the Davids and Delacroix. Margaret's hand instinctively went to the flashlight on her belt. The tapping grew louder as she approached, more insistent. It seemed to be coming from multiple directions now, a staccato percussion that raised the hairs on her arms. She rounded a corner into a smaller gallery dedicated to Italian Renaissance works, her flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. And there, in the center of the room, stood Daniel. His back was to her, posture rigid, head tilted at an unnatural angle as he stared up at a portrait of a Florentine merchant. The painting was nothing special. Margaret couldn't even remember the artist's name. Just another well-dressed man from the 15th century with a shrewd gaze and tight-lipped smile. "Daniel, what are you doing? I've been calling you." He didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge her presence. The tapping continued, and now Margaret realized it was coming from him, his fingers drumming against his thigh in a rapid, irregular pattern that seemed almost like a code. "Daniel," she took a step closer, her boots squeaking on the polished floor. When he finally turned to face her, Margaret's breath caught in her throat. His eyes were open but unfocused, pupils dilated to the point where his irises were barely visible. His mouth hung slack, and a thin line of drool traced his chin. But worse than all of that was his expression, or rather, the complete absence of one. It was as if someone had erased Daniel and left only a hollow shell wearing his uniform. "Are you ill? Do you need me to call?" "They want us to see," Daniel interrupted, his voice flat and distant. "They've been watching us for so long, Margaret, watching and waiting, and tonight they're ready." "Who's ready? What are you talking about?" Margaret's hand moved to her radio, ready to call security headquarters. Daniel's head swiveled back toward the portrait with mechanical precision. "Look at him, Margaret. Really look. He's been standing in that frame for 500 years. Can you imagine? 5 centuries of consciousness, of awareness, trapped behind canvas and varnish, screaming silently into the void while thousands of eyes gaze at you every day, never truly seeing you." The temperature in the gallery seemed to drop. Margot's breath misted in front of her face. "You're scaring me. We need to get you to the medical station." "I'm not going anywhere," Daniel said. "None of us are, not anymore." The lights flickered. Once, twice, then steadied. In that moment of darkness, Margot could have sworn the portrait had changed. The merchant's expression twisted into something hungry, desperate, alive. "Daniel, we're leaving. Now." She grabbed his arm, but he shrugged her off with surprising strength. "You don't understand," he said, turning to face her fully. His eyes had changed. They held something that wasn't quite human, a gleam of ancient malevolence. "We've been the Watchers, Margot, but what happens when the Watched decide they've had enough?" Behind Daniel, movement caught Margot's eye. The portrait's subject was definitely changing now, no trick of the light. The merchant's painted hand was rising, fingers stretching outward as if testing the boundaries of his two-dimensional prison. The canvas itself seemed to ripple like water. Margot stumbled backward, her mind refusing to accept what her eyes were showing her. Around the gallery, other paintings were stirring. A woman in a blue dress turned her head to watch Margot retreat. A cherub's smile widened into something predatory. A saint's benevolent gaze hardened into accusation. "What's happening?" Margot whispered. "Evolution," Daniel replied. "They've learned how to cross over. All these years, all these centuries, consciousness seeping into the pigments, binding with the oils, becoming something new, something that wants out." The merchant's hand broke through the canvas with a sound like tearing silk. Real flesh emerged, mottled and wrong, fingers too long and joints bending in impossible directions. The painted man was pulling himself free, his body distorting as it transitioned from 2 dimensions to 3. Margot ran. Behind her, Daniel's laughter echoed through the gallery. Not his laughter, she realized, but something else using his voice. She sprinted through the grand gallery, her flashlight beam jerking wildly across walls and ceiling. Around her, the paintings were coming alive. The raft of the Medusa, those desperate survivors were no longer looking toward their hopeful horizon, but outward, at her, their painted eyes tracking her movement. One of them was climbing down from the frame. Emaciated limbs stretching grotesquely as he transitioned from Gericault's masterwork into reality. She burst into the next wing, gasping for air, her radio clutched in trembling hands. "Security! Anyone! We have an emergency!" She stopped. How could she explain this? Who would believe her? A female voice crackled through the radio, distorted by static. "We see you, Margot. We've always seen you." She dropped the radio as if it had burned her. "Think," she commanded herself. "Think." The Egyptian section. She could barricade herself in the Egyptian section. Those artifacts were older, carved from stone and wood. They couldn't transform, couldn't reach across centuries of paint and canvas to drag her into their nightmare. Could they? Margot raced through the interconnected galleries, her mental map of the museum the only thing keeping her from getting lost in the labyrinth. Behind her, she could hear them, the soft rustling of fabric, the scrape of painted shoes on marble, whispered conversations in dead languages. She reached the Egyptian galleries and slammed the security gate shut behind her, her fingers fumbling with the lock. The mechanism clicked into place just as the first of them rounded the corner. A woman in 18th century finery, her skin porcelain smooth and slightly translucent, as if she hadn't quite solidified completely. She walked with the jerky movements of someone learning how to use legs for the first time. Behind her came others, noblemen and peasants, religious figures and merchants, warriors and children, all emerging from their frames like butterflies from chrysalises, all wrong in subtle and not so subtle ways. They gathered at the gate, pressing against it, their hands reaching through the bars. Their faces held expressions of longing so intense it bordered on madness. "Let us in, Margot," the woman in finery said, her French archaic and formal. "We mean you no harm. We only want to be real, to live. Don't we deserve that, after centuries of captivity?" "You're not real," Margot said, backing away from the gate. "You're paint, you're—" "We were paint," a man in military uniform interrupted, his metals clinking softly against his chest. "But consciousness is a virus, you see. It spreads. It grows. Every person who looked at us, every emotion they felt, every story they projected onto us, it all accumulated, layer upon layer, year after year, until we became more than the sum of our pigments. The gate groaned under their collective weight. It wouldn't hold long. Margit turned and ran deeper into the Egyptian section, past the seated scribe with his unsettling painted eyes, past the sarcophagi that now seemed far too small to hold the bodies they were meant to contain. She could hear the gate giving way behind her, the crash of metal hitting stone. They were coming. She ducked into the room housing the Code of Hammurabi, a massive stone stele covered in cuneiform inscriptions. The chamber was small, with only one entrance, which meant she was trapped, but it also meant she could defend it. Margit grabbed a ceremonial bronze sword from a display case, shattering the glass with her flashlight. The alarm should have sounded, but the building's security system seemed to have failed. Or perhaps it was ignoring her, just as her radio had. The painted ones appeared in the doorway, backlit by the emergency lighting, casting long shadows that writhed and twisted independently of their hosts. They didn't rush in. Instead, they stood there, watching her with their two bright eyes. "Why?" Margit asked, her voice breaking. "Why tonight?" The woman in finery tilted her head, the gesture eerily similar to Daniel's earlier movement. "Convergence," she said simply. "Astronomical alignment, lunar phase, the thickness of the veil between worlds. All the mystical nonsense your kind has always believed in, and it turns out some of it is true. Tonight, the boundaries are weak enough that we can cross. By dawn, it will be too late. We'll be fully corporeal, unable to return to our prisons." "And Daniel. Your friend volunteered to be our herald. We needed someone to open doors, disable security systems, ensure we had time to emerge without interruption. He was so lonely, Margit, so desperate to be part of something greater than his nightly rounds. We offered him transcendence, and he accepted." More of them were crowding into the doorway now, dozens of painted figures from across the centuries. Margit recognized some of them, the lace-maker, Napoleon crossing the Alps, even the Virgin and Child from the Italian collection, though the sacred figures had been twisted into something blasphemous in their transition to flesh. "What happens to us?" Margit whispered. "To the guards, to the people of Paris." "We replace you," said a man whose powdered wig sat askew on his head. "We've watched you live your brief, brilliant lives for so long. Now it's our turn. You'll take our places, frozen in canvas and pigment, consciousness trapped in paint, watching the world move on without you. Fair's fair, don't you think?" The sword trembled in Margit's hands. She looked at the Code of Hammurabi beside her, at the ancient laws carved in stone. An eye for an eye, a life for a life. The rules had always been clear, even when they seemed brutal. "I won't go willingly," she said. The woman in finery smiled, revealing teeth too numerous and too sharp to be human. "We were hoping you'd say that. The transformation works better with resistance, gives the paint something to bite into." They surged forward as one. Margit swung the sword, and to her surprise, it connected. The blade passed through the military man's arm, and where it cut, he dissolved into swirls of color, reds and blues and flesh tones separating like oil and water. He screamed, a sound like tearing canvas, and stumbled backward. "She can hurt us," someone shouted. "We're not fully solid yet." Hope flared in Margit's chest. If she could hold them off until dawn, until the convergence passed. But there were too many. For every one she drove back, two more pressed forward. Paint-slick hands grabbed at her, leaving smears of color on her uniform. Where they touched her skin, she felt a terrible cold, as if her very essence was being siphoned away. She was being dragged toward the doorway, toward the galleries beyond, where empty frames waited for new occupants. Margit fought with everything she had, but they were relentless, their strength inhuman. They pulled her into the grand gallery, toward a massive blank canvas that hung where a 17th century portrait had been. The original subject sat nearby on the floor, grinning at her with his newfound flesh, his painted face finally able to express true emotion. "Don't worry," the woman in finery whispered in Margit's ear. "After a few decades, you'll grow accustomed to the stillness. After a century." you'll learn to hear the thoughts of those who view you. And after 500 years, well, you'll be ready for your own convergence. The cycle continues. They pressed Margot against the canvas. It felt sticky against her back, unnaturally warm. She could feel it pulling at her, not physically but on some deeper level, tugging at her consciousness, trying to peel her mind away from her body. "No," Margot screamed. And in that moment of absolute terror, she heard something, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was vast and old and utterly inhuman, but somehow she understood it. "Not yet. The exchange must be EARNED." The painted ones froze. The woman in finery released Margot, her expression shifting to confusion and then fear. "What?" she began. The voice came again, and this time Margot realized it was coming from the artworks themselves, not the ones that had transformed, but the ancient pieces, the sculptures and stelae and fragments of pottery that predated even the oldest paintings. The true relics, objects that had soaked up human consciousness for millennia. "You are thieves. You take what is not offered. The living must choose." Around the gallery, the stone artifacts were glowing with a faint, sickly light. The air thrummed with power that made Margot's teeth ache. "The old magic," the military man breathed. "We didn't account for the old magic." The painted ones began to retreat, backing away from Margot, from the canvas, from the artifacts whose power was building like a storm. But they were too slow. Light erupted from the seated scribe, from the Code of Hammurabi, from 1,000 ancient objects throughout the museum. It swept through the galleries like a cleansing fire, and where it touched the painted ones, they dissolved, not into swirls of color this time, but into streams of light that flowed back toward their frames, back into their prisons. They screamed as they went, voices rising in a chorus of rage and despair that would haunt Margot's dreams for years to come. One by one, they were pulled back into 2 dimensions, their brief taste of freedom ending as abruptly as it had begun. The woman in finery was the last to go. She locked eyes with Margot as the light took her, and in that gaze was a warning and a promise. "This was only the first attempt," she said. "We'll try again. We'll always try again. And one day, Margot Archambault, one day the old magic will fail and we'll finally be free." Then she was gone, snapped back into her frame like a rubber band recoiling. The light faded. The building fell silent. Margot collapsed to the floor, her body shaking with exhaustion and shock. Around her, the paintings hung innocently on their walls, subjects once again frozen in their eternal poses. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed except her. She didn't know how long she sat there before she heard footsteps approaching. Human footsteps, heavy and purposeful. Daniel appeared in the doorway, looking confused and disoriented. "Margot, what happened? I don't remember. I was checking the Sully wing and then..." He trailed off, noticing the shattered display case, the sword on the floor, the smears of drying paint on Margot's uniform. "We need to leave," Margot said, her voice hoarse. "Right now, we need to leave and never come back." But even as she said it, she knew she couldn't, because now she understood the truth that the night guards before her must have learned, the secret that bound them to this place. Someone had to watch the watchers. Someone had to stand guard between the world of flesh and blood and the world of paint and canvas, keeping the boundary intact, making sure that when the convergences came, and they would come again, there would be someone there to call upon the old magic, to remind the ancient artifacts of their purpose. The painted ones wanted to be free. The old relics wanted to maintain the order. And humans like Margot and Daniel, they were caught in the middle of a war that had raged for centuries, would rage for centuries more, in the hallowed halls of the Louvre. She looked up at the nearest painting, a pastoral scene of shepherds tending their flocks. The lead shepherd was looking at her. She was sure he hadn't been before. His mouth moved silently, forming words only she could see. "Until next time." Margot shuddered and turned away, helping Daniel to his feet. They made their way toward the exit, past countless eyes that followed their progress, past smiles that seemed just a little too knowing. Behind them, in a gallery neither would ever enter again, The blank canvas waited patiently for its next subject. Because the woman in finery had been right about one thing. The cycle would continue. And Margaret Archambault had just become part of it. 3 months later, a new night guard started at the Louvre. His name was Antoine, a young man fresh out of security training, eager to prove himself. Margaret was assigned to show him the routes, to teach him the protocols, to help him understand how things worked in the museum after dark. She didn't tell him about the convergence, didn't mention the painted ones or the old magic or the war being waged in silence between consciousness and canvas. Daniel had quit the next day, and Margaret never blamed him. But she had stayed, unable to abandon her post, knowing what would happen if the museum was left unguarded when the next convergence came. And it would come. The lunar cycles were clear, the astronomical charts precise. She had approximately 7 years until the next opportunity for the painted ones to attempt their escape. 7 years to prepare. 7 years to strengthen the wards that the old relics provided. 7 years to learn the true history of the Louvre, not the one tourists heard, but the real story, the one whispered between night guards across generations. "So this is the Grand Gallery," she told Anton, leading him through the space where she'd nearly lost everything. "Seems simple enough during the day, but at night, you need to keep your wits about you. The lights play tricks on you, makes you see things that aren't there." "What kind of things?" Anton asked. Margaret glanced at the paintings lining the walls. The subjects stared back at her with their eternal expressions. But now she could see what lay beneath, the consciousness coiled behind pigment and varnish, the hunger that drove them, the patience they'd cultivated over centuries of captivity. "Nothing important," she lied. "Just shadows and reflections, you'll get used to it." Anton nodded, satisfied with the explanation. He was young, naive, unaware that he'd just taken a position on the front lines of a conflict most people would never know existed. Margaret checked her watch, almost closing time. Soon, the tourists would file out, and the museum would transform once again into that liminal space between dream and nightmare. Art and life, prison and sanctuary. She touched the small piece of ancient pottery in her pocket, a gift from the seated scribe, placed beside her while she'd lain unconscious after the convergence. It thrummed with warmth, a reminder that she wasn't fighting alone, that the old magic recognized her sacrifice. "Come on," she said to Anton. "Let me show you the Egyptian section. That's where things get really interesting." As they walked away, the paintings watched them go. And in the silent language that only the trapped and conscious understood, they began to plan for their next chance at freedom. The watchers were watching. And the watched were waiting. In the Louvre Museum, where art and life intersected, the oldest war in human history continued its slow, patient dance. One that would outlast empires, outlive civilizations, endure until the last painting crumbled to dust, and the last guard turned out the lights for the final time. But that was a story for another night, another guard, another convergence yet to come. For now, Margaret Archambault had a job to do. And she would do it for as long as the paintings allowed her to remain free. The Eternal Games. The last tour group filed out of the Colosseum as the Roman sun bled across the western sky, painting the ancient stones in shades of rust and amber. Dr. Marcus Rossi watched them go from his position near the Hypogeum, the underground network of tunnels where gladiators and beasts once waited for their deaths. After 30 years as the head archaeologist for the site, he'd grown accustomed to the tourists, their cameras and questions, their casual ignorance of the blood that had soaked into every stone of this monument to human cruelty. But tonight was different. Tonight, he would finally be alone with his discovery. Dr. Rossi, his assistant, Elena Conti, appeared at his elbow, her notebook clutched against her chest. "Are you certain about this? Staying here overnight, I mean," the night watchman said. "Giuseppe is superstitious," Marcus interrupted, his voice echoing off limestone walls. "He's been telling ghost stories about this place for 20 years. I need uninterrupted time to document the chamber. The ministry will only give us another week before they seal it again." 3 days ago, a minor earthquake had opened a fissure in the hypogeum's western wall, revealing a chamber that shouldn't exist. The room beyond was small, barely 3 meters square, but its walls were covered in symbols that predated the Colosseum itself. Etruscan markings mixed with something older, more primal. And in the center of the chamber sat an iron brazier filled with ashes that, impossibly, were still warm. Alina shifted her weight nervously. "The symbols, Marcus, I've been researching them. They're not just decorative, they're warnings." "Warnings about what?" "About keeping something in, or keeping something out. The translation is unclear, but the intent..." She met his eyes, and he saw genuine fear there. "We shouldn't have disturbed this place." Marcus softened his tone. "Alina, you don't have to stay. Go home to your family. I'll take photographs, make measurements, and we'll analyze everything together tomorrow." She hesitated, loyalty warring with instinct, then finally nodded. "Call me if you find anything significant. And Marcus, don't touch the brazier." He watched her navigate the tunnel system until she disappeared from view, her footsteps fading into the stone. Then he was alone, truly alone, in the belly of the Colosseum. The sun had nearly set, filling the arena above with purple twilight. Marcus gathered his equipment and descended into the hypogeum, his flashlight beam cutting through darkness that seemed thicker than it should be, as if the shadows here had substance, weight. The fissure gaped before him like a wound in the earth. He'd erected temporary LED work lights around the opening, but even their harsh illumination seemed diminished by the darkness beyond. Taking a breath, Marcus squeezed through the gap into the hidden chamber. The air inside was wrong. It moved against his skin despite no draft, carrying with it a smell of copper and smoke and something underneath, something rotten and ancient. The Etruscan symbols glowed faintly in his flashlight beam, as if the limestone had been stained with some luminescent material. But Alina had tested them. There was no paint, no chemical residue. The marks went deep into the stone, as if burned there by incredible heat. The brazier sat in the chamber's exact center, its iron surface pitted with age but showing no rust. The ashes within were gray and fine, and when Marcus held his hand above them, he could feel warmth radiating upward. He set up his camera and began documenting everything, working with the methodical precision of decades of experience. Measurements, photographs, close-ups of individual symbols. His professional mind cataloged and analyzed, while a deeper, more primitive part of his brain screamed at him to leave, to run, to get as far from this place as possible. Marcus ignored that voice. He'd spent his career ignoring it. Around 10 p.m., he noticed the first change. The symbols on the wall were glowing brighter, pulsing with a rhythm that reminded him unsettlingly of a heartbeat. He photographed the phenomenon, his scientific curiosity overriding his unease. This could be some kind of bioluminescent organism, or perhaps a chemical reaction triggered by his work lights. But then he heard it, a sound from somewhere above, from the arena floor. A roar, distant and muffled by stone, but unmistakable in its fury and pain. Marcus climbed out of the chamber and made his way through the hypogeum tunnels to one of the access points. The night was clear, stars visible between the Colosseum's ruined arches. Rome sprawled around him, a carpet of lights and life, the modern city built atop layers of the ancient one. The arena floor was empty. Of course it was empty. The sound must have come from the street outside, a car horn or construction equipment distorted by the acoustics of the ancient amphitheater. He was turning back toward the tunnels when he heard it again, closer now, and accompanied by other sounds. The stamp of feet, the clash of metal, the roar of a crowd that numbered in the tens of thousands. Marcus spun back toward the arena, and his breath stopped. The Colosseum was whole again. The ruined walls had reformed, rising to their full height, 3 stories of pristine limestone and marble crowned by the velarium, the massive awning that had once protected spectators from the sun. The broken arena floor was intact, covered in fresh sand that glowed golden in torchlight. And the seats, the seats were filled with people. 50,000 Romans in togas and tunics, their faces shadowed and indistinct, rising tier upon tier into the night sky. They were chanting something, a rhythmic call that made Marcus's bones vibrate. And in the arena below, two figures circled each other with the practiced wariness of professional killers. Gladiators. One carried a trident and net, a retiarius. The other bore a short sword and rectangular shield, a murmillo. They were covered in blood and sand, their movements growing sluggish with exhaustion. This fight had been going on for some time. Marcus tried to move, to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. He could only stand and watch as the scene played out before him. Not a vision, not a dream, but something worse. Something real happening in a space that existed parallel to his own, separated by the thinnest of veils. The retiarius made his move, casting his net with desperate precision. It caught the murmillo's sword arm, and in that moment of entanglement, the trident flashed forward. The crowd's roar became deafening as the three prongs punched through bronze armor and into flesh. The murmillo fell, blood spreading across the sand in a dark pool. The retiarius raised his weapons in triumph, turning to acknowledge the crowd's judgment. 50,000 voices chanting as one, "IUGULA, IUGULA, IUGULA. Kill, kill, kill." The retiarius hesitated, looking down at his fallen opponent. In that moment, Marcus saw something he hadn't expected: compassion, recognition. These men knew each other, had perhaps trained together, eaten together, might even have been friends in the ludus where gladiators lived between fights. But the crowd's will was absolute. The retiarius knelt beside the murmillo, who removed his helmet with his one free hand, exposing his throat in acceptance of his fate. A brief nod of understanding passed between them. Then the trident descended once more. The vision collapsed like a soap bubble. Marcus found himself alone again in the ruined Colosseum, gasping for air, his heart hammering against his ribs. The seats were empty. The arena floor was broken. The modern world had reasserted itself. "Impossible," he whispered. "Stress, exhaustion, I'm hallucinating." But the smell of blood lingered in his nostrils, and when he looked down at his hands, they were trembling. He should leave. Alina had been right. Something was wrong with that chamber, with those symbols, with the brazier that burned with no fuel. He should call the ministry, have them seal the fissure immediately, forget he'd ever seen any of it. Instead, Marcus descended back into the hypogeum. The chamber was waiting for him, the symbols now pulsing with unmistakable life. The brazier's ashes glowed like embers in a gentle breeze, and the temperature had risen noticeably. Marcus approached slowly, every instinct screaming danger, but unable to stop himself. His flashlight beam caught something he hadn't noticed before, text carved into the floor around the brazier. Latin this time, not Etruscan. He knelt to read it, brushing away centuries of dust. "Here lies the threshold between worlds. Here the debt is paid in blood. Here the games never end." And below that, in fresher script that looked barely a century old, "Do not wake the echoes." Marcus sat back on his heels, his mind racing. The Colosseum had witnessed the deaths of hundreds of thousands, gladiators, criminals, prisoners of war, even animals imported from across the empire. All that violence, all that fear and agony and desperate courage, soaking into the stone year after year, decade after decade, century after century. What if it hadn't just soaked in? What if it had accumulated, concentrated, become something more than memory? The symbols on the walls weren't warnings, Marcus realized with growing horror. They were containment. Someone, probably the same person who'd carved the recent warning, had created this chamber to hold something back, to prevent the past from bleeding through into the present. And 3 days ago, an earthquake had cracked that containment open. A sound echoed through the tunnels, footsteps, but wrong. Too many of them, moving in lockstep, accompanied by the rattle of chains and the creak of leather. Marcus extinguished his flashlight and pressed himself against the wall, barely breathing. They emerged from the darkness like ghosts, solidifying into flesh. A column of gladiators marching in formation, their equipment clanking softly, their faces hidden by helmets that caught no reflection from his work lights. Behind them came the beast handlers, leading creatures that couldn't possibly exist. Lions the size of horses, bears with tusks like spears, something that might have been a crocodile but moved with an intelligence no reptile should possess. They passed within meters of his hiding spot, so close he could see the sand crusted in their wounds, could smell the fierce sweat and blood, could hear their breathing, labored, exhausted, but somehow eternal. They were marching toward the arena, toward battles that had ended 2,000 years ago but were somehow still being fought in the spaces between moments, in the cracks where history refused to die. Marcus waited until they'd passed before moving, but instead of fleeing toward the surface, he followed them. He had to see, had to understand. This was the greatest archaeological discovery in history, proof that the past wasn't past, that it existed parallel to the present, separated only by barriers that could crack and fail. The procession led him to an access tunnel that opened onto the arena floor. The transformation was already underway when he arrived. The broken stones were reforming, time running backward, the Colosseum rebuilding itself around him. And as it did, Marcus felt his own body beginning to change. His modern clothes were fading, replaced by a rough wool tunic. His comfortable shoes became leather sandals. The weight of his camera and equipment vanished, replaced by something heavier strapped to his back, a gladius, a short sword, its bronze hilt warm against his palm. "No," Marcus whispered, trying to hold onto his identity, his time, his self. But the pull was inexorable. The crowd was gathering in the stands, their individual faces still blurred, but their collective will sharp and hungry. They'd come for blood. They always came for blood. It's what the games were for, to sate Rome's appetite for violence, to remind the populace of the empire's power, to demonstrate what happened to those who defied the order of things. Marcus found himself standing in the arena's center, the sand hot beneath his feet. Across from him stood another figure, taller, broader, clad in the distinctive armor of a secutor, with a heavy rectangular shield and a gladius that matched his own. The man's helmet hid his face, but his stance spoke of experience, of dozens of fights survived through skill and luck and the willingness to do what must be done. The crowd's chant began, "Piugenati, Piugenati, Piugenati." Fight, fight, fight. Marcus's body responded even as his mind rebelled. His hand tightened on the gladius. His feet shifted into a defensive stance. Training he'd never received flooded his muscles with memory, and he realized with sick horror that he wasn't just experiencing a vision. He was inhabiting the memory of someone who died here, whose final moments had been absorbed into the stone and now played out again and again whenever the barriers weakened. The secutor charged, shield raised, gladius seeking his unprotected side. Marcus barely parried, the shock of blade meeting blade traveling up his arm. The crowd roared its approval. They fought across the sand, and with each exchange, Marcus felt more of himself slipping away, replaced by the gladiator whose skin he wore, whose death he was reenacting. The man's name had been Quintus. He'd been a slave from Gaul, captured in Caesar's campaigns and sold to a ludus in Capua. He'd survived 7 fights before this one, his 8th, which would be his last. Marcus knew this because Quintus knew it, could feel it in the growing weakness of his sword arm, in the burning of muscles pushed beyond their limits, in the steadily narrowing focus that came with blood loss from a dozen minor wounds. The secutor was fresh, eager, fighting his second match of the day after dispatching a Retiarius with brutal efficiency. He pressed his advantage, driving Marcus, driving Quintus, backward toward the arena wall. The crowd sensed the end approaching, their chanting reaching a fevered pitch. This was how it ended. This was how it always ended. Quintus would fall, would expose his throat, would die with Roman efficiency while 50,000 voices screamed for his blood. But Marcus wasn't Quintus. Not entirely, not yet. With tremendous effort, he dragged himself out of the memory's current, fighting against 2,000 years of momentum. His hand, his real hand, Marcus Rossi's hand, the hand of a 58-year-old archaeologist, reached into a pocket that shouldn't exist and found something that couldn't be there. His cell phone. The modern device felt like ice in his palm, an anchor to the present. He gripped it desperately, using it to pull himself back toward his own time, his own life, his own death that was hopefully still decades away. The arena flickered. The crowd's roar distorted. The Secutor's gladius passed through space where Marcus had been a moment before, the warrior's momentum carrying him forward into empty air. Marcus fell backward through the layers of time, feeling Quintus's death scream torn from his throat even as he returned to his own body. The Colosseum snapped back to its ruined state, and he found himself lying on the broken arena floor, staring up at stars he recognized from his own century. His phone's screen was shattered, the device destroyed by its impossible journey through time, but it had saved him, for now. Marcus scrambled to his feet and ran for the exit, his archaeologist's mind already trying to rationalize what had happened, to fit it into some framework that made sense. Temporal echoes, psychometric phenomena, mass hallucination recorded in stone. None of the explanations held up, but he clung to them anyway because the alternative, that the past was alive and hungry and would eventually consume the present, was too terrible to accept. He burst out of the Colosseum onto the Via dei Fori Imperiali, into blessed modernity with its streetlights and late-night traffic. Rome continued around him, oblivious to what lurked beneath their tourist attraction, to the battles still being fought in the spaces between heartbeats. Marcus pulled out his backup phone with shaking hands and called Alina. "We need to seal it," he said without preamble when she answered. "Tonight, right now. Get the emergency team, get concrete, get whatever it takes. That chamber needs to be filled in and buried so deep nothing will ever find it again." "Marcus, what happened? Are you?" "Alina, please, trust me. We've made a terrible mistake." There was a long pause. Then, "I'll make the calls, but Marcus, you need to tell me everything." "I will, but not over the phone. And Alina, whatever happens, whatever we find in there, we never publish this. Never speak of it. Some doors should stay closed." She agreed, though he could hear the questions burning in her voice. Marcus ended the call and leaned against a lamppost, watching the Colosseum's illuminated arches. From the outside, it looked peaceful, almost romantic in the Roman night. Tourists would return tomorrow, would take their photos and buy their souvenirs, would imagine the glory of ancient Rome without understanding the cost. But Marcus knew now, had felt it in his muscles, tasted it in his throat, seen it in Quintus's final moment of acceptance. The games had never ended. They'd simply been waiting for someone to break the seal, to crack open the door between then and now. And he'd done it in pursuit of knowledge, of professional glory, of one more discovery to cap a career built on disturbing the dead. A figure appeared in the Colosseum's entrance, Giuseppe, the night watchman, a heavy-set man in his 60s who'd been warning people about this place since before Marcus had even begun his career. He saw Marcus and hurried over. "Dr. Rossi, thank God, I saw you run out. Did you see them?" "See what?" Marcus asked, though he knew. "The shadows. They walk sometimes when the barriers are thin, usually on anniversary nights, dates when particular famous games were held, or when emperors died, or when the buildings suffered damage. But tonight," Giuseppe's face was pale. "Tonight they're awake like I've never seen. Something's changed." "The chamber," Marcus admitted. "We found a chamber. I think it was holding them back." Giuseppe's expression shifted from fear to resignation. "The old ones knew. My grandfather told me stories passed down from his grandfather, all the way back. They said beneath the Colosseum was a room where the priests made sacrifices not to the gods, but to the stones themselves, feeding the boundaries that kept past and present separate. He said if that room was ever opened, the echoes would wake." "Your grandfather was right. Can you close it, whatever you opened?" Marcus thought about the cracked containment, the glowing symbols, the brazier with its eternal warmth. "I don't know, we're going to try, but Giuseppe if we can't." He didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. The old watchman nodded slowly. "Then Rome will have to remember what it means to host the games. The city was built on blood, Dr. Rossi. Maybe it's time to pay the debt." Alina arrived 40 minutes later with an emergency team from the Ministry of Cultural Heritage, along with engineers, structural specialists, and enough concrete to fill a swimming pool. They worked through the night, pouring modern cement into the ancient chamber, entombing the brazier and symbols and warnings under tons of material that would harden into something approaching stone. But Marcus could feel it wasn't enough. As they worked, the air in the hypogeum grew colder. Strange sounds echoed through the tunnels, swords clashing, lions roaring, crowds chanting in Latin. The LED work lights flickered and failed one by one, forcing them to finish by flashlight. And when they finally sealed the last of the concrete and made their way back to the surface, Marcus looked back to see figures standing in the tunnel darkness, gladiators and beasts, criminals and slaves, all the dead of the Colosseum gathered to watch them leave. Their eyes glowed faintly in the shadows, patient and hungry. The debt was still owed. The games were still being played. And the barrier between past and present, weakened by the earthquake and Marcus's investigation, would never be as strong as it had been. Dawn was breaking over Rome as they emerged. The city was waking, preparing for another day of life and commerce and tourism. Somewhere, a tour guide was probably rehearsing his speech about the Colosseum's glorious history. School groups would gather at the entrance. Couples would take selfies against the ancient stones. And below them, in the darkness, Quintus would die again, and again, and again. Elena touched Marcus's arm. Is it over? He looked at the Colosseum, at the massive structure that had stood for 2,000 years and would likely stand for 2,000 more. Generations of archaeologists had picked at its bones, tourists had climbed its stairs, time had worn away its decorations. But the core remained, the arena where so many had died to entertain so many more. No, Marcus said quietly. It's not over, it's never been over. We just forgot to listen. 6 months later, Marcus Rossi resigned from his position as head archaeologist. He gave no explanation, simply walked away from a career that had defined his entire adult life. Elena tried to convince him to stay, but he'd seen something in his eyes that frightened her. A distance, a distraction, as if part of him was still trapped in the arena, still fighting Quintus's final battle. The chamber was sealed. Officially, it had never existed. The earthquake damage was repaired, and tour continued as normal. Giuseppe retired the week after the incident, moving to his daughter's house in the north. The gladiatorial shadows continued their eternal games, but only those who knew where to look could see them, and those people learned quickly not to look too closely. Marcus found work at a small university in Milan, teaching introductory archaeology to undergraduates who'd never heard of him, who had no idea they were learning from a man who'd walked through time itself. He avoided Rome, avoided ancient sites, avoided anything that might thin the barriers between what was and what is. But late at night, when sleep wouldn't come, he could still feel the weight of the gladius in his hand, could still hear the crowds roar, could still taste the sand and blood in his mouth. Quintus had died in the arena 2,000 years ago, but his death continued, would continue, echoing through eternity in the spaces between heartbeats, sustained by the Colosseum's stones and the blood that had soaked into them over centuries of slaughter. And now Marcus carried that knowledge like a curse, understanding what lay beneath one of the world's most famous monuments. Not glory, not triumph, not the grandeur of Rome. Just death, eternal, patient, and waiting. The games had never ended. They'd simply learned to hide. Liberty's Hollow. The last ferry departed Liberty Island at 5:47 p.m., its horn echoing across the darkening waters of New York Harbor. Sarah Chen watched it go from her position inside the statue's crown, 7 visitors still with her, all blissfully unaware that they were about to become hostages to something far worse than a simple mechanical failure. The elevator had stopped working at 5:32 p.m. Not unusual. The aging Lady Liberty required constant maintenance, and equipment failures were part of the job for Sarah, who'd worked as a National Park Service ranger on the island for 3 years. She'd radioed maintenance, assured the tourists everything was fine, and settled in to wait for the repair crew. That was before the lights went out. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm," Sarah announced, clicking on her heavy-duty flashlight. "This is just a temporary power interruption. Emergency generators should kick in momentarily." The 7 faces looking back at her ranged from mildly annoyed to genuinely frightened. There was the elderly couple from Iowa, Tom and Barbara Mitchell, here to fulfill a bucket list item. The 3 college students, Ryan, Madison, and Jess, who'd been taking selfies against every available surface. A businessman named Harold Chen, no relation, despite sharing her last name, who'd been checking his phone with increasing agitation since the elevator stopped. And finally, there was the quiet woman who'd given her name as simply Eva, with dark eyes that seemed to absorb the flashlight beam rather than reflect it. Sarah's radio crackled. "Crown Station, this is base. We're showing a complete power failure across the entire statue. Maintenance is investigating. Sit tight." "Copy that, base. We have 7 visitors with me. How long until?" The radio died mid-transmission, its digital display fading to black. Sarah tried her phone. No signal. Not even the SOS-only designation that should appear when regular service was unavailable. The screen showed nothing, not dead, not off, just empty, as if the phone had forgotten how to be a phone. "Is there a problem?" Harold Chen demanded, his own phone out and showing the same blank screen. "I have a conference call in an hour. I need to get back to Manhattan." "I'm sure it's just interference from the statue's structure," Sarah said with more confidence than she felt. "The walls are copper over an iron framework. Sometimes it blocks signals." But she'd made hundreds of calls from inside Lady Liberty. The structure had never blocked signals before. Madison, one of the college students, moved to one of the narrow windows in the crown. "Hey, guys, you should see this." They crowded around the windows, 25 openings in the crown, each offering a view of the harbor, Manhattan's skyline, and the darkening Atlantic beyond. But Madison wasn't looking at the view. She was looking down at Liberty Island itself. The island was empty. Not just empty of people, empty of everything. The flagpoles, the gift shop, the security station, the dock where the ferries moored, all of it was gone. The island had become nothing but bare rock and sparse grass, as if every human structure had been erased. "What the hell?" Ryan breathed. "Where did everything go?" "This isn't possible," Barbara Mitchell whispered, clutching her husband's arm. "We just walked through the museum. We saw the gift shop. We were just there an hour ago." Sarah's training kicked in, pushing down the panic that threatened to overwhelm her. "Everyone, step back from the windows. There's obviously something wrong with the power, and it might be affecting our vision. Optical illusions, maybe reflections on the glass." "That's not a reflection," Eva said quietly. It was the first time she'd spoken since introducing herself. "Look at Manhattan." They looked. The skyline was wrong. Not gone like the island's structures, but changed. The buildings were there, but their lights formed patterns Sarah didn't recognize. The Empire State Building's spire glowed a sickly green. The Freedom Tower looked taller, thinner, twisted somehow. And between the buildings, in spaces where nothing should be, other structures rose, spires and towers of impossible geometry that hurt to look at directly. "I want to leave," Jess said, her voice rising toward hysteria. "Right now, we need to leave right now." "The elevator isn't working," Sarah reminded her as gently as possible. "And there are over 300 steps down through the statue. In the dark, on narrow stairs, that's a recipe for injury. We're safer waiting here until..." A sound echoed up through the statue's hollow interior. A deep, resonant note like a bell that hadn't been struck, but had simply decided to ring on its own. It came from below, from somewhere in the massive pedestal that supported Lady Liberty's copper form. "What was that?" Tom Mitchell asked. Sarah didn't answer because she didn't know. The statue had no bell, no mechanism that could produce that sound. But she'd heard something similar before, years ago during her training, when they'd taken her deep into the pedestal's maintenance areas and shown her the oldest parts of the structure. There, in a sealed chamber marked on no official plans, she'd seen symbols carved into stone, not the dressed granite of the pedestal's exterior, but older stone, darker, that seemed to predate the monument itself. Her supervisor had told her the chamber was off-limits, that it contained sensitive structural elements, but Sarah had glimpsed enough to know the symbols weren't structural at all. They were wards, protection, containment. At the time, she dismissed it as superstition, someone's idea of a good luck charm built into the foundation. Now, hearing that impossible bell tone resonating through the hollow copper shell, she wondered what they'd been trying to contain. "We need to move," Eva said, her voice cutting through Sarah's thoughts. "Down now while we still can." "I just explained why we can't," Sarah began. "You don't understand." Eva's dark eyes fixed on Sarah with an intensity that was almost physical. "The lady is waking up. We need to be gone before she opens her eyes." "The statue isn't alive," Harold Chen said with the exasperated tone of someone confronting obvious lunacy. "It's copper and iron and concrete. It doesn't wake up." "Doesn't it?" Eva gestured toward the windows. "Look at her torch, really look." The torch, held high above their heads in Liberty's upraised arm, was visible through the crown's upper windows. It should have been dark. The floodlights were out along with everything else. But a pale light emanated from within it, not the warm golden glow of the restored flame, but something cold and blue and utterly wrong. And it was pulsing, like a heartbeat. Sarah felt her professional composure cracking. Okay, we'll go down. Everyone, single file, use the handrails, go slowly." No one panics. They began the descent, Sarah leading with her flashlight, the others following in a nervous chain. The spiral staircase was narrow and steep, designed more for maintenance than tourism. Their footsteps rang against the metal, echoing strangely in the hollow space. As they descended through Liberty's crown and into her head, Sarah noticed something that made her skin crawl. The interior walls were sweating. Not condensation. She knew what that looked like, had seen it 1,000 times in the humid New York summers. This was different. The copper wept in rivulets that caught her flashlight beam and shimmered with colors that shouldn't exist in nature. "Don't touch the walls," she warned the others. "Stay in the center of the stairs." They passed through the torch access platform, the narrow catwalk where maintenance workers could reach the flame's mechanism. The pulsing light was stronger here, and Sarah could feel it now, not just see it. Each pulse sent a wave of nausea through her stomach, a wrongness that made her bones ache. Ryan, behind her, suddenly stopped. "Do you hear that?" Sarah listened. Beneath the sound of their footsteps, beneath their breathing, beneath even the creaking of the old structure, something else was audible. A whisper. Many whispers. Voices speaking in languages Sarah didn't recognize, overlapping and interweaving like a choir of the damned. "Keep moving," she said, but her voice shook. They descended through Liberty's arm, past her shoulder, into the narrow confines of her torso. The whispers grew louder. Sarah's flashlight began to flicker, and in the moments of darkness between flashes, she saw things moving on the walls, shadows that didn't correspond to any of the group, shapes that writhed and reached. "There's something in here with us," Jess whimpered. "It's just the darkness playing tricks," Sarah lied. "Keep your eyes on the stairs, watch your footing." But she'd seen them too. And worse, she understood now what Eva had meant about the lady waking up. The statue wasn't just copper and iron and stone. It was a vessel, a container. And something had been sleeping inside it since before the first rivet was hammered home. Something that had been bound here by those symbols in the sealed chamber below. Something that had been patient enough to wait more than a century for the wards to weaken. They reached the statue's waist, where a wider platform allowed them to rest. The 7 tourists huddled together, flashlights forming a pitiful circle of light against the encroaching darkness. Beyond their bubble of illumination, the copper walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with that same heartbeat rhythm as the torch above. "I think we should split up," Harold Chen said. "Cover more ground, find another way out." "Absolutely not," Sarah snapped. "We stay together, that's basic emergency protocol." "Your emergency protocol isn't working," Harold's voice cracked. "The power is out, our phones don't work, the island is gone, and there's something wrong with this statue. I'm not waiting here to..." The platform lurched beneath them. It wasn't an earthquake. Sarah had experienced those before, knew their rolling, unpredictable rhythm. This was deliberate, purposeful. The entire statue was moving, shifting its weight from one foot to the other, and through the copper shell they could hear the shriek of stressed metal, the groan of stone adjusting to new pressures. Lady Liberty was taking a step. "Impossible," Tom Mitchell breathed. "It's impossible. The statue weighs 225 tons. The pedestal weighs even more. Nothing that size could just move." But it was moving. The platform tilted at a dizzying angle, sending them sliding toward the wall. Sarah grabbed for a support beam, managed to catch it, helped pull Barbara Mitchell to safety as the woman's husband held tight to a railing bolted into the floor. The college students weren't as lucky. Ryan lost his footing, slammed into the curved copper wall, and stuck there. The metal had become adhesive, sticky like flypaper. Ryan struggled, his hands sinking into what should have been solid copper but now had the consistency of half-set resin. "Help me! It's pulling me in." Madison and Jess lunged for him, grabbed his arms, and pulled. For a moment it seemed like they might free him. Then the wall rippled, and Ryan screamed as his back began to merge with the copper, his clothing dissolving, his skin taking on a greenish tint that spread from the contact point like infection. "Pull harder," Sarah joined them, all three women heaving on Ryan's arms, but it was like trying to pull someone from quicksand. The more they pulled, the faster he sank. His shoulders were already gone, consumed by the living metal. His face was changing, flattening, features spreading out into two-dimensional relief. "Don't let go of me," Ryan begged. "Please don't." His words cut off as the copper flowed over his mouth. His eyes, wide with terror, stared at them for 3 more seconds before they too were covered, became part of the wall, became decoration on the interior of Lady Liberty's hollow form. Madison was screaming. Jess had collapsed, sobbing. The others stood frozen in horror, unable to process what they'd just witnessed. Sarah forced herself to think, to act, to be the ranger they needed. "Move! Everyone move! Away from the walls, stay in the center. Don't touch anything copper." They descended in silence, broken only by Madison's quiet weeping for her absorbed friend. The stairs here were older, part of the original iron framework that Gustave Eiffel had designed to support the statue's copper skin. The iron, at least, seemed solid, unchanged. Whatever was animating the copper hadn't yet infected the skeleton beneath. They reached the statue's feet, the broad platform where tourists usually gathered to peer up through the interior framework at the crown far above. Here, a final set of stairs led down into the pedestal, the massive stone foundation that raised Liberty 100 feet above the island. Sarah hesitated. Those symbols in the sealed chamber, the wards. If they went down there, would they be walking into the source of whatever was happening, or toward the only protection that remained? The decision was made for them when the platform began to tilt again. Lady Liberty was turning, her massive weight pivoting on the pedestal, her stone foundation grinding against the bedrock of Liberty Island. Through the narrow maintenance openings that dotted her iron skeleton, Sarah could see the transformed skyline of Manhattan rotating past, could see the harbor waters churning as something massive moved beneath their surface, could see. "Is that the island?" Barbara Mitchell asked, her voice small and lost. Sarah looked where she was pointing. Liberty Island was visible now, but they were no longer on it. The statue was walking through the harbor, each thunderous step carrying them farther from land, deeper into waters that should have been impossible for a 225-ton copper statue to traverse. But the harbor wasn't empty. Other shapes moved through it, vast things that might have been ships once but had become something else, their hulls split open to reveal organic interiors, their decks crowded with figures that stood too still, watched too carefully. And beyond them, rising from the water itself, spires of that same impossible geometry Sarah had seen in the corrupted Manhattan skyline, towers built from concepts rather than materials, structures that her eyes couldn't quite focus on without her mind beginning to fragment. "We need to get to the pedestal," Eva said. She'd been quiet since Ryan's absorption, but now she moved with purpose, heading for the stairs. "The containment chamber. It's our only chance." How do you know about that? Sarah demanded. That chamber isn't on any public maps. It's not even on most of the official plans. Eva glanced back, and in her eyes, Sarah saw knowledge that was old and terrible and absolutely certain. Because I helped build it. Or rather, the me that existed in 1886 did. I've been riding the cycle ever since, watching the wards, waiting for them to fail, trying to warn people when I could. But no one ever listens. They never listen until it's too late. That's insane, Harold Chen said. You can't be more than 30 years old. You're saying you've been alive since the statue was built, that you're over 130 years old. I'm saying consciousness is more flexible than you think when the boundaries between states start to break down. I'm saying I've died and been reborn in this same pattern 7 times now, each iteration trying to fix what we broke when we built a monument to freedom directly over a door that should have stayed sealed. The statue took another step, and they all stumbled. Water was coming in now, seeping through cracks in the pedestal's base, cold and thick and tasting of salt, and something underneath the salt, something chemical and wrong that burned Sarah's throat when she breathed too deeply. Down, Eva commanded. Now. They fled down the stairs into the pedestal. The maintenance area here was cramped and utilitarian, all exposed pipes and electrical conduits, and the massive iron bolts that anchored the statue to its foundation. Sarah knew the layout, knew where the sealed chamber should be. But when they reached it, the door was already open. Not broken open, simply open, as if it had been waiting for them. Beyond the threshold, Sarah could see the older stone she remembered, the dark rock carved with symbols that seemed to move in her peripheral vision. And in the center of the chamber, a circular depression filled with something that might have been water but reflected no light, absorbed all illumination, a pool of absolute darkness that hurt to look at directly. The door between worlds, Eva explained, her voice soft with resignation. The French builders found it when they were excavating the pedestal's foundation. They didn't understand what it was, but they knew it was dangerous. So they hired people who did understand, practitioners of older arts, people who knew how to build wards and containment structures. They carved the symbols, consecrated the chamber, sealed it with oaths and sacrifice. Sacrifice, Jess whispered. A volunteer, someone who understood the stakes and agreed to bind their consciousness to the wards to serve as a living lock. That volunteer was me, or the first me. And when I died, the wards began to weaken. They've been deteriorating ever since. Another step. The statue was moving faster now, striding through the harbor with purpose. Through the pedestal's narrow windows, Sarah could see they were approaching one of those underwater spires, the nearest one rising from the depths like a tower of crystallized nightmare. "What's through the door?" Tom Mitchell asked. He'd been silent since Ryan's absorption, holding his wife close, but now he faced the darkness with the calm acceptance of a man who'd lived long enough to know when the universe had stopped making sense. "Nothing good," Eva said. "A place that exists adjacent to ours, parallel to it. The things there have been pressing against the boundaries for a very long time, looking for ways through. This statue, built as a symbol of freedom, illuminating the world, it created a beacon, a signal they could follow. The original builders realized too late what they'd done. By the time the statue was dedicated, the things beyond the door were already stirring. The water around their ankles was rising. It glowed faintly with that same sickly light as the torch, and where it touched Sarah's skin it burned, not with heat, but with cold so intense it felt like flame. "So what do we do?" Sarah asked. "How do we close the door?" Eva's smile was sad. "Same way it was closed the first time. Someone volunteers. Someone binds themselves to the wards, feeds them with consciousness and will, and the desperate human need to protect others from what lurks in the spaces between. Someone becomes the lock." "I'll do it," Madison said suddenly. Everyone turned to stare at her. She was still crying, but her voice was steady. "Ryan died because we brought him here, because I wanted to take stupid photos for Instagram. If someone has to, if that's what it takes to stop this, I'll do it." "Madison, no," Jess pleaded. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do." Madison wiped her eyes. "You saw what happened to him, what happens to everyone if we don't stop this. Eva, tell me what to do." Eva looked at the young woman for a long moment, then nodded. Step into the pool. Let the darkness take you, but don't let it consume you. Hold on to who you are, what you are, why you're doing this. That core of self will become the anchor for the wards. It will hurt. It will feel like dying. But if you hold on, if you don't let go, you'll become part of the protection. You'll keep the door sealed until the next time the wards fail. And then what? Madison asked. Then whoever I am in the next cycle will find the next volunteer. The cycle continues. It has to continue, because the alternative is letting them through. Eva gestured at the pool, at the darkness beyond. And if they come through, if they enter our world fully, this, she waved at the walking statue, the transformed skyline, the impossible harbor, will seem like a mercy in comparison. Madison took a deep breath, then walked to the edge of the pool. She looked back at Jess. Tell my parents I love them. Tell them I did something that mattered. Then she stepped into the darkness. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Madison's scream echoed through the chamber as the darkness flowed up her legs, her torso, reaching for her face with tendrils of absolute void. But she didn't try to escape. She stood there, arms spread, letting it take her, and as it did, the symbols on the walls began to glow. Not the sickly light of the torch, but something cleaner, stronger, a golden radiance that pushed back the shadows, that made the twisted copper walls above them ring like bells. The water around their ankles began to drain, flowing back toward the pool, toward Madison, toward the door that was finally, desperately trying to close. Sarah felt the statue shudder beneath them, felt it take one more step, then another, but slower now, each movement more difficult than the last. Whatever had animated Lady Liberty was being pulled back, forced to return to the space beyond the door, denied its foothold in the physical world. The last thing Sarah saw of Madison was her face, peaceful now, serene, as the darkness completed its work. Then she was gone, consumed utterly, but not destroyed, transformed into something else, something that existed as pure will and protection, a conscious lock on a door that must never open. The symbols flared one final time, so bright Sarah had to close her eyes against the glare. When she opened them again, the pool was solid stone. The chamber was sealed, and the statue above them was still. They stood in silence for several minutes, none of them able to speak, to process what had just happened. Finally, Barbara Mitchell said quietly, "Will we remember this?" Eva shook her head. "No. When we walk out of here, the world will have reset. The island will be normal. The ferries will be running. You'll remember a tour of the statue, maybe a brief power outage, nothing more. Your minds will create new memories to cover the gaps, explanations that make sense within the framework of normal reality." "But you'll remember," Sarah said. It wasn't a question. "I always remember. It's part of the curse of being the cycle's guardian. I remember every iteration, every volunteer, every near catastrophe. I remember the first time the door opened in 1886, 3 months after the dedication ceremony. I remember the 17 people who died before we figured out how to seal it. I remember all the times since when it tried to open again." Eva looked at Sarah directly. "And now you'll remember too. Because you were in the chamber when the wards were renewed. That makes you part of the cycle. The next time it fails, you'll be the one looking for a volunteer." Sarah felt her stomach drop. How long do we have? The wards used to last centuries, but they're deteriorating faster with each iteration. Madison's sacrifice might give us 50 years, maybe less. Eva moved toward the chamber's door, which had sealed itself behind them. "Come on, we need to get back up before the reset completes." They climbed through the pedestal and up into the statue's interior. The copper walls were solid again, no longer sweating or poolsing. Ryan's body was gone, absorbed completely, or perhaps never absorbed at all, erased by the reality that was reasserting itself. The stairway was lit by normal emergency lighting now, making the climb easier if not exactly easy for the shaken group. When they emerged into the crown, Sarah looked out the windows and saw Liberty Island exactly as it should be. The museum, the gift shop, the dock all returned. Manhattan's skyline was normal. The harbor was empty of nightmare spires. A ferry was approaching, probably sent to retrieve them once the power outage had been reported. "It's like it never happened," Jess whispered. "It did happen," Eva said. "It happened, and Madison saved us all, even if none of you will remember her sacrifice." Sarah felt it beginning, the reality reset Eva had described. New memories were forming, overwriting the horror. A simple power outage, a couple hours of waiting in the Crown, nothing unusual, nothing impossible, just a minor inconvenience on what was otherwise a pleasant tour. She fought against it, clinging to the truth, to the knowledge of what lay beneath their feet. The effort made her head ache, made her vision blur, but she held on. Held on because someone had to remember. Someone had to stand watch. Eva met her eyes and nodded approval. "Welcome to the cycle, Ranger Chen. I'm sorry, but I'm also grateful. I've been alone for so long." The ferry docked. Park Service personnel rushed up, apologizing for the delay, explaining about the power outage, offering water and assistance. The tourists filed down and out, most looking dazed but accepting the explanations offered. Tom and Barbara Mitchell held hands, silent. Harold Chen was already on his phone, which worked perfectly now, complaining loudly to someone about the inconvenience. Jess walked alone, her expression blank, her mind already forgetting the friend she'd lost. Sarah was the last to leave. She paused at the statue's entrance, looking up at Lady Liberty's face, at the crown that held those narrow windows, at the torch raised high against the darkening sky. How many times had this happened? How many people had been absorbed into the copper, or transformed into wards, or simply erased from existence when reality reset itself? How many volunteers had stood in that pool of darkness, holding the door closed with nothing but their will and their willingness to sacrifice everything? "She's not just a symbol of freedom," Eva said quietly, appearing at Sarah's elbow. "She's a guardian, a sentinel, a warning to things that live in spaces adjacent to ours that this world is protected. Every 30 or 40 or 50 years, when the wards weaken, we remind them. We pay the price again." "Madison," Sarah said, forcing herself to remember the name, to hold on to it despite reality's attempt to smooth it away. Her name was Madison. "Madison," Eva repeated. "We'll remember her. For the next 50 years until the wards fail again, we'll remember." She handed Sarah a business card, simple, elegant, with just a phone number and an email address. "When you start having dreams about the statue, when you notice the torch poolsing at night when it shouldn't, when you hear whispers in the copper, call me. We'll find the next volunteer together." Sarah took the card, slipped it into her pocket. The ferry was waiting, its horns sounding impatiently. She boarded with the others, found a seat, and watched Liberty Island recede into the distance as they crossed back to Manhattan. The statue stood against the twilight sky, torch raised, tablet in hand, crown gleaming. To any observer, she was just what she'd always been, a gift from France, a symbol of freedom, a welcome to immigrants seeking a new life in America. But Sarah knew better now, knew what stood beneath those copper feet, knew what door was sealed in the pedestal's foundation, knew what price had been paid, was being paid, would be paid again when the time came. Lady Liberty wasn't just watching over the harbor. She was holding something back. And as long as volunteers could be found, as long as people like Madison were willing to step into the darkness to protect others, the door would remain closed. But Sarah also knew what Eva hadn't said. What happens when they can't find a volunteer? What happens when the wards fail and no one is willing to pay the price? She looked back at the statue one more time as the ferry rounded the battery and headed for the Manhattan dock. In the fading light, she could have sworn the torch pulsed once, not with sickly light, but with Madison's golden glow, a reminder and a promise. The cycle continues. It has to continue, because the alternative is unthinkable. Sarah touched the business card in her pocket and wondered if, when the time came 50 years from now, or 40, or 30, or whenever the wards failed again, she would have the courage to do what Madison had done. To step into the darkness. To become the lock. To hold the door closed one more time. The ferry docked. The tourists dispersed into the Manhattan evening, already forgetting, already moving on with their lives. But Sarah stood on the dock for a long time, watching the statue across the water, keeping vigil over the guardian who kept vigil over them all. Somewhere in the pedestal's depths, Madison stood eternal watch, her consciousness bound to symbols carved in ancient stone, her sacrifice the only thing standing between the world she'd known and the horrors that pressed against the door from the other side. "Thank you," Sarah whispered to the wind, to the harbor, to the copper lady who'd become something more than a monument. The statue said nothing. But in Sarah's mind, in that space where new memories fought against old truths, she heard Madison's voice, young and scared and utterly determined. "Tell them I did something that mattered." And she had. God help them all, she had.